Welcome back, everyone. Before we start, please comment down below what times it currently is wherever you live. Let's get to it. Your master enters, clutching a well-worn copy of Galen's texts, and declares, "The stars above, the blood within. This is where your journey begins." Before the next thought crosses your mind, you're tasked with diagnosing your first illness, using only the alignment of planets and the patient's humours. Are you ready to find out how medieval doctors truly operated? You pull your cloak tighter as a cool wind from the sea twists through the narrow streets of Salerno. Around you is chaos, alive with traders shouting over each other, bells clanging from some unseen church tower, and students, like yourself, hurrying past with worn leather satchels slung over their shoulders. The university town smells of wood, smoke, and bread, but also of something sharper, perhaps medicinal herbs, maybe something less pleasant, like the tannery a few alleys over. You're here, fresh off a long journey, with everything you own crammed into one saddlebag. Whatever nostalgia you might feel for home is quickly drowned out by the sheer noise of it all. This isn't the quiet village you left behind, and, as you soon realize, it's not the peaceful oasis of scholarly calm you imagined, either. To the people bustling around you, you're just another wide-eyed student, probably too green to even know your way to the lecture hall. Some of the locals toss you disapproving glances as they push past. A few merchants, spotting your unfamiliar face, call out half-hearted pitches for cheap quills, ink, or whatever they think they can sell to an untested scholar. Overhead, laundry hangs between the buildings on precarious lines, fluttering as if mocking your discomfort. The town itself is an odd mix of grandeur and grit. A looming cathedral casts a shadow over rowdy taverns, while the crumbling stone walls at the city's edge tell a history far older than any of the students now rushing to class. In the distance, someone yells in a language that isn't Latin, maybe Greek or Arabic, a reminder of just how far outside your element you really are. The university, when you finally find it, is no less intimidating. The entrance is guarded not by literal soldiers, but by its reputation. Salerno, after all, is known as one of the greatest medieval centers of learning, and you're just one unproven student among hundreds. Inside, the courtyard teems with pupils, and it's clear almost immediately that social hierarchy is just as much a part of academia as books and lectures. Your clothes, made of sturdy but unremarkable wool, are noticed almost immediately. A few students wearing fine fabrics that practically scream noble birth give you a glance, though not a warm one. Others, more modestly dressed, seem equally wary, perhaps trying to calculate whether you'll be a competitor or an ally. It doesn't take long to figure out your place in this pecking order. Your accent? That marks you as an outsider. Your posture? Too stiff, clearly new. Every detail about you is noticed, judged, and catalogued by those around you. In your mind, you try to do the same, though it's hard to think straight with so much happening at once. The professors, when you finally glimpse them, only add to your unease. They command respect with their sheer presence, some of them wearing robes that seem better suited for cardinals than doctors. You overhear fragments of conversations between older students, whispers that some professors are harsher than others, or that one master's lectures are known to stretch for hours without pause. Choosing a master, you've heard, is crucial. A good one can elevate even a mediocre student. A bad one? Well, they say the fastest way to fail out of medical school is to pick the wrong mentor. But if you're lucky, and luck, it seems, is as much a part of this process as talent or preparation, you'll find someone willing to take on your inexperience and mold you into something resembling competence. Eventually, you're guided, or maybe pushed toward the lecture hall. It's not grand in the way you might have dreamed as you packed your things and left home. The air inside is murky, a mix of dust and candle wax, though it carries a faint aroma of parchment that borders on comforting. Wooden benches rise in tiered rows around a central pulpit, scratched and scuffed from decades of use. Some of the students around you fidget nervously, others lean in with eager anticipation. Whether they're from noble families or humble beginnings makes no difference here. Everyone's here to learn what they can or survive what they must. On the lecturer's desk lies a stack of texts. Just looking at them from across the room, you can tell they're old, older than any one person in the room, and written in neat, unfamiliar script. Latin. Every single word of it. Then, without much ceremony, your master places one of these books into your hands. It's heavier than you expected, the leather binding rough and sturdy. You open it and are greeted by the dense, small script that fills every page. To you, it might as well be written in code. Sure, you've learned a little Latin, but this? This is something else entirely. The other students don't seem to react, but you suspect most of them are drowning in silent panic, same as you. The master instructs you to examine the opening passage. Do not look at the words, he says sharply. Look at the meaning. Which of course is unhelpful if you don't understand the words in the first place. But this is how it starts. You study not just under professors, but under the weight of history itself. These texts, they tell you, are the very foundation of medicine. Hippocrates, Galen, Avicenna, their words shaped the work of countless physicians before you, and now, they're your first and perhaps most intimidating teachers. Suddenly, the long journey to Salerno feels like the easy part. Surviving here? That's going to be the real challenge. How do you learn medicine when you can't even read the language it's written in? That's the first question that hits you when the heavy, leather-bound Latin text lands in your hands. It's not rhetorical either. You're genuinely standing there, staring at neat lines of text, convinced every single letter might as well be runes from some far-off land. Sure, you prepared or as prepared as you thought you'd need to be. You'd picked up enough Latin to greet someone, name a handful of vegetables, maybe stumble through a prayer. But this is entirely different. The words blur together, dense and unyielding, like a fortress you've just realized you have no map to navigate. Latin dominates medicine here. It's like the skeleton key to a locked door you desperately need to open. Every major medical text, Hippocrates, Galen, and even the more recently translated works of Avicenna and Arabic scholars, is preserved in its Latinized form. Over time, Latin became the universal language of medicine, respected and used in universities like this across Europe. But that doesn't make it kind or easy for you as a student who didn't grow up speaking it. It wasn't just the language of medicine, it was the gatekeeper. To understand it, you'd first have to survive it. And here's the brutal setup for your first year at Salerno or wherever you've chosen to start this grueling journey. You are expected, no, required, to know Latin if you want even a chance of understanding medical theory. It's not like your professors will drop translations or offer any shortcuts either. It's sink or swim. Sadly, most students start out sinking. You probably couldn't pay them to admit it, but you're all in the same boat, long hours spent poring over texts that might as well be incantations, trying to figure out basic anatomy or how humours work, while feeling utterly defeated by the grammar alone. It doesn't help that the texts are steeped in antiquity. They're dense, meticulous to a fault, and assume the reader already understands a certain baseline of Latin mastery that you, frankly, do not. In a way, your days start to resemble less the academic enlightenment you dreamed of, and more a cruel endurance test built on repetition. Memorization becomes your companion and unwelcome one. At that, the works of Galen, thick with anatomical diagrams and medical theories, won't read themselves, but reading is only step one. Professors won't care if you read the section on the four humours once. They'll care if you can recite it, word for word, in Latin, probably on command in the middle of the lecture hall. If it sounds absurd, it is. But, believe it or not, the point wasn't just to torment students into submission. Medicine was built on the idea that understanding and memorizing the wisdom of the ancients would prepare you for practice. You're not just repeating some guy's thoughts to pass an exam. You're trying to embody centuries of knowledge, even if your modern sensibilities scream for more practical, hands-on work. Let's not sugarcoat your early experiences with these texts. They're as infuriating as they are awe-inspiring. Hippocrates often seems cryptic, like the kind of person who'd answer a question with a riddle rather than giving you clear advice. On the other hand, Galen loves to give definitions for things so obscure you spend half an hour just finding out what he's even referring to. And then there's Avicenna, who manages to blend brilliance and frustration into every single line of his translated texts. But mixed with the frustration is this undeniable sense of awe. These people were working out theories and systems about the human body thousands of years ago, and while they may not have gotten everything right, their work is enough to fill you with something rare hope. It's part of what keeps you going, even as you mangle conjugations and curse yourself for not starting your Latin lessons earlier. In the beginning, even simple phrases feel impossible as they crawl across the parchment. Just trying to string together the pieces of one sentence can take over an hour. You pull apart the meaning slowly, like unraveling a knotted thread. Words, roots, endings, all of it has to be right. Precision matters because these texts built how medieval people understood medicine. Slip-ups can lead to major misunderstandings. It's not your native tongue, sure, but there's no room for excuses. Maybe after a week, You get through one section only to realize your master expects you to present it back flawlessly by the next morning. No pressure, right? But over time, bit by agonizing bit, something starts to click. A verb here, a phrase there. The concepts feel foreign, but they're creeping into your brain no less surely than autumn frost creeps through a drafty room. The breakthrough happens one day when you least expect it. Amidst the overwhelming clutter of long sentences and medical jargon, you find yourself staring at a passage. It's something Galen wrote about diagnosing patients through their urine. Before, this would have been a brick wall. But now? Now you're reading it. Slowly, haltingly. Sure, but it's there. You understand the gist of what he's saying, and in this moment, after months of feeling like you're not getting anywhere, it's like a window bursts open in your mind. For the first time, you don't just feel like a student fumbling in the dark. You feel like a scholar. There's a rush of pride, almost enough to forget how far you still have to go. But the moment is brief, because the next page is tougher than the last, and the next lecture wrenches you back into reality. Latin isn't suddenly your best friend because you managed to read a paragraph, but it no longer feels like your worst enemy, either. It's a tool, a frustrating, imperfect tool, but one you're finally starting to figure out how to use. Still, knowing how to translate Latin is one thing. Interpreting what these little symbols of ink actually mean in practice is another challenge entirely. See, realizing Galen's theory about humours or recognizing a quote from Hippocrates doesn't tell you much if you don't know what they were trying to convey. You're at the point now where the words make sense to you. But do they make sense in the world around you? You'll look back at this stage later on and realize it was just a small step in the process. But for now, it feels monumental. One thing is clear. This mastery of language isn't about showing off during oral tests or writing immaculate notes. It's about survival. The language of medicine is often the first mountain many medieval students have to climb, and it sorts out who's here to stay and who isn't. As you set the book aside, satisfied for a moment with the smallest spark of progress, you realize something else. These texts, these ancient passages, are more than just obstacles. They are the very foundation of what comes next. They don't merely ask that you read them, they ask that you learn from them, that you internalize their knowledge. Now that you've started to crack the code, a new question lingers in your mind. A much bigger question. What do these texts really say about health, the body, and what it means to treat illness? Why does your professor insist that your personality depends on how much phlegm you have? It's not a joke, at least not to the medieval physician standing at the front of the lecture hall. By now, you're already well aware that medicine in 1300 rests firmly on the foundation of ancient theory. And the four humours? That's where the entire framework begins. The theory, undeniably ambitious for its time, sees the human body as a mirror of the natural world. Just as the elements fire, air, earth and water govern the natural order, their counterparts exist inside you too. Yellow bile, blood, black bile and phlegm. These aren't just metaphors either. Your health, personality, and even your fate supposedly hinge on how well these fluids stay balanced. Your master explains it to the room with the same confidence you might expect from someone describing gravity. Everything within us, he announces, is influenced by the humours. You are hot and dry, or cold and wet, or perhaps something in between, but the balance of these qualities governs all. From the first moment he mentions these qualities, it feels like you're trying to decode an ancient puzzle. Hot and wet? Cold and dry? You scribble furiously on a scrap of parchment, thinking maybe those combinations will one day make as much sense to you as they clearly do to him. But for now, they feel as foreign as the Latin text you struggled through just days ago. He starts with blood, the humour linked to the spring warm, moist, and brimming with vitality. This, he tells you, makes someone sanguine. They're joyful, self-assured, and brimming with energy. Next is yellow bile, fiery, hot, and dry, associated with summer. Too much of it, and you're choleric, prone to irritability and quick bursts of temper. Then there's black bile, tied to the coolness of autumn and dryness of the earth. Melancholic personalities, as you might guess, are reflective, withdrawn, and miserable when the black bile goes too far. And finally, with a long-suffering glance at the few students already yawning, your master introduces phlegm. Its cold and wet nature rules the winter, dampening energy and making people sluggish, calm, maybe even excessively dull. He doesn't hide his bias-phlegmatic types, in his eyes, need to try harder. It's not just your personality that's linked to these humours, though. The professor is relentless, describing how even your body's cycle shelf, moods, inclinations are governed by the ebb and flow of these fluids. If you're quick-tempered, it must be because yellow bile is dominating your temperament. If you're prone to apathy, it's phlegm slowing you down. But if the balance tips too far one way or the other, you're suddenly not just cranky or tired, you're officially sick. This imbalance is what you'll spend your career unraveling in every patient that crosses your path. Forget germs or bacteria, this is where medieval medicine places its bets. But theory is one thing, and identifying these imbalances is another entirely. Your professor starts laying out diagnostic methods with unnerving energy, as though he's describing a creative hobby rather than your future duties. One such method involves inspecting urine. A lot of urine. It's not just about colour, either consistency, odour, and even taste. Yes, taste. All play a role in determining which humours are out of line. You can already feel your stomach protesting, but you dare not question his enthusiasm. Another tool in your new diagnostic arsenal? Bloodletting, but that's more of a treatment, as your master reminds you. Diagnosis often begins before the patient even walks into the room. Patients, you're told, carry clues in every aspect of their lives. Where do they live? What do they eat? Even the climate of their homeland affects their humours. A farmer from a humid coastal village already skews wet, for instance, so a doctor has to approach their illness differently than they might approach a merchant from an unbearably dry inland dust bowl. And then there's another unexpected factor waiting to complicate your education: the stars. That's right, celestial bodies, hanging impossibly far above your patient, are just as responsible for their health as the bread they eat or the water they drink. The alignment of the planets, especially at the time of a patient's birth, leaves its own mark on their humoral balance. At this point, you're starting to wonder if diagnosing a patient might feel more like astrology than medicine. And honestly, sometimes it does. Physicians in your time pored over astrological charts with great care, believing the heavens influenced the body's elements as surely as the changing seasons influenced crops. You're shown how to map the stars, how to correlate them with the humours, and how to bring the cosmic and the bodily into perfect alignment, at least close enough to decide which treatments might work. Still, all these methods, the endless samples of urine, the ritualistic blood exams, the cryptic star chart serve one purpose: to uncover the imbalance disturbing the patient's equilibrium. The moment you finally piece it together for the first time, it hits differently than you expect. A local farmer stumbles in one morning, complaining of sluggishness, chills, and unshakable fatigue. It's winter, and you've memorized enough to know that cold and wet conditions amplify phlegmatic tendencies. You go through the motions sexamining what you can, guessing where you can't, and then it clicks. He is, by definition, a patient whose humours have tipped too far toward cold and wet. When your master nods in approval, vaguely pleased that you didn't completely embarrass yourself, it feels like the stars themselves just aligned for you. Of course, diagnosing is only half the game. You know this much even as you stammer out your first successful diagnosis. Calling someone hot and dry or cold and wet means nothing if you don't know what to do about it. Treatment is where things get interesting and terribly messy. As your professor moves on, waving a hand as he gestures toward a table of colourful herbs and ominous scalpels, you can't help but wonder, how far does all this theory really go when you're faced with a body that can no longer balance itself? But, for now, your attention shifts to what's next now to fix what the stars, humours, and body have thrown into chaos. What do leeches, herbs, and astrology have in common? In medieval times, they were the holy trinity of medical treatment. Let's say a farmer walks into your small consulting space with a hacking cough and a pale, sluggish demeanour. The answer, obviously, isn't a quick prescription or a lecture on hygienethis, is the 1300s. Instead, you assess his humours, glance at your astrological charts, and wonder if some dandelion tea and a few well-placed leeches might do the trick. It might sound absurd now, but in your world, this is just how medicine works. The first line of treatment for nearly any ailment often started with herbs. Your desk would be stacked with jars filled with dried leaves, flowers, roots, and seed seech, one believed to have its own signature, its own power to heal. You'd reach for calendula to reduce inflammation, elderberry to fight off fevers, or maybe mint to soothe digestion. The exact choice depended not just on the symptoms, but also on the doctrine of signatures, a guiding principle for many medieval physicians. This curious theory suggested that plants bore subtle hints about their purpose. Skullcap, for example, with its seed pods shaped like miniature heads, was believed to treat headaches. Lungwort, A plant whose spotted leaves resembled diseased lungs was turned into tonics for coughing fits or even tuberculosis. It wasn't superstition for you. It was proof that nature, or possibly God, had embedded remedies in the world, hidden in plain sight. Herbal remedies weren't just brewed into teas or stuffed into poultices. Some required careful timing to prepare, which is where astrology made its entrance. If you were preparing a salve for a chest infection, it might seem straightforward. Combine the herbs, boil them up, and send the patient home. But that would be reckless. You'd need to check the heavens first. If Mars was in opposition or the moon was waning, the timing might be poor for crafting anything meant to nurture or heal. Astrological charts weren't just guides for mysterious celestial occurrences, they were blueprints for medical practice. The constellations influenced when medicines were prepared, when patients were treated, and even when certain ailments might worsen. Some scholars taught entire courses on medical astrology, so it wasn't a fringe belief. It sat at the crossroads of science and faith, daring you to balance both. And when herbs alone couldn't cut it, that's when bloodletting took center stage. There's nothing quite like the sight of a starving leech wriggling in a basin to bring home the reality of medieval medicine. Your professor likely spent an entire afternoon explaining the fine art of bloodletting, the idea being simple: too much blood, or blood of poor quality, could cause a host of issues. It wasn't that your body was actively rebelling, rather, your humors had tipped precariously off balance. The solution? Drain the excess. It sounds stomach-turning now, and, honestly, it probably was back then, too, but it was considered a cornerstone of treatment. Leeches weren't the only option, though. Metal instruments like lancets were used to make small incisions, allowing excess blood to flow. For larger imbalances, or in particularly stubborn cases, you might even recommend multiple sessions. You'd be expected to measure carefully, choosing the exact vein and volume to draw out based on the patient's symptoms and, again, the alignment of the stars. Timing a bloodletting session wasn't just a matter of scheduling, it was almost an art form. The zodiac tied directly into the humoral system, assigning every part of the body a ruling celestial influence. For instance, Aries governed the head, Leo the heart, and so on. Imagine needing to calculate not only how much blood to draw, but whether the planets were aligned enough to make the procedure successful. Miscalculate, and the patient might get worse, never recover at all. But medieval treatments weren't all knives, leeches, and astrology. Dietary changes were another mainstay in your growing playbook of medical interventions. The wrong kind of food, or sometimes just the wrong amount, was thought to upset someone's internal balance. Since each food carried its own humoral qualities, it wasn't just about calories or flavors. Apples, for instance, were considered moist and cool, ideal for calming a patient with excess heat. Bread, especially dense or spiced varieties, was warm and dry, perfect for counteracting cold and wet humors. Your recommendations would span beyond just meals. Avoid heavy drinking, stop whenever you're full, and for heaven's sake, cut back on the meat if you've been coughing up phlegm all week. While the advice might sound frustratingly basic at first glance, it showed an awareness of how the environment, diet, and behavior could all impact health, even if the underlying theory sometimes relied more on metaphor than biology. Still, for all these methods, treatments weren't purely practical. They carried with them an undeniable thread of ritual and symbolism. The mixing of ointments, the careful timing of incisions, even the gathering of herbs each act felt steeped in something larger than the action itself. Whether that was the divine influence of God, the alignment of heavenly bodies, or the invisible balance of humors, there was always an undercurrent of something profoundly mystical. Medicine, in your world, wasn't just about healing. It was about restoring harmony, not only within the body but between the patient and the forces that shaped their universe. But let's not pretend it was all theory and ideals. Every treatment was a gamble. You'd watch patients return, week after week, sometimes looking better, sometimes worse. When they improved, it felt satisfying in a way that's hard to describe, like you'd just tilted the universe slightly back into order. Maybe you recommended nettles to purge a cold patient or advised extra cinnamon to warm up someone who always felt sluggish, simple but effective measures that seemed to confirm everything you'd learned. Then, there's the weirder pride, almost a smugness, when you followed your charts to the letter, chose the exact right combination of stars and plants, and the patient actually got better. It made you question, just for a moment, whether the cosmos were truly working in tandem with your craft, but it wasn't all victories, far from it. When treatments failed, as they often did, you were left guessing whether it was your technique, their constitution, or perhaps the will of the heavens themselves. You'd re-evaluate their humours, recheck the astrological charts, and redose the herbs. But sometimes, no amount of fine-tuning worked, leaving you at a crossroads. And when that happened, there was only one, incredibly daunting next step: surgery. A word that, in this era, carried its own sense of dread both for you and for your unfortunate patient. As you cleaned your tools and prepared your mind, you couldn't help but think back to the stars, the herbs, the leeches, and wonder if you'd missed something. Because the battlefield of surgery wasn't just another step forward, it was a whole other world of unknowns. And, like it or not, it was where your skills would truly be put to the test. How do you learn surgery when you're not even allowed to cut into a human body? That's the looming question, as the concept of surgery swims into view during your exhausting studies of medieval medicine. You sit on a worn wooden bench in your lecture hall, your master perched above like a disapproving hawk, hammering in Galen's teachings on anatomy. The problem? Deep down, everyone knows Galen never studied humans. He had monkeys, goats, pigs, anything but the real thing. Now you're expected to learn surgery from second-hand descriptions, animal dissections, and fragile assumptions. And you can't help but wonder, how many mistakes does it take before someone speaks up? Spoiler: it's not happening today. The church, of course, isn't making things any easier. They step firmly between you and any chance of touching an actual cadaver. Their stance is clear: human dissection is a violation of the body's sanctity. The flesh, they argue, must remain intact to honor resurrection at the end of time. The easiest way to sum this up? No cutting allowed. To them, the human body is not a canvas for medical experiments. It's a sacred creation. And you, painfully mortal and prone to mistakes, are decidedly not qualified to mess with it. But of course, the dying patients you're trying to save don't really care about all that nuance. They'd probably prefer you understand their insides before you start poking around with a scalpel. So how do you build this knowledge base? Welcome to the awkward workaround of animal anatomy. You and your classmates gather around a goat or a sheep, watching as your professor demonstrates the rough equivalents of human organs. They wield their knife with authority, pointing out where blood vessels branch and how muscle fibers align, but in the back of your mind, you're already hesitant. A goat's chest doesn't look like a human chest. A sheep's joints bend differently. It's impossible to ignore the gaps between your lessons and the realities that will await you in practice. You make your notes anyway, sketching diagrams and listening carefully as they connect sinew and bone with names in Latin, always Latin. The smell of blood clings to the air as your professor declares, "Remember, the heart is the furnace of the body, and the liver its source of vitality." But is that a human heart? They're talking about her, just the sheep's passable imitation of one? Your manuals and treatises offer little reassurance. Galen's works dominate the surgical curriculum, and while his brilliance is undeniable, his knowledge is, frankly, outdated. He insisted blood passed through invisible pores between heart chambers, which sounds more like guesswork than fact. His accounts of nerves and muscles feel ingenious until you remember he based them on animals, not the human body he wasn't allowed to dissect. These texts are sacred in the way all ancient knowledge seems to beaven when later generations discover they have holes big enough to drive a cart through. But questioning them? That's not on the table. The professors don't welcome skepticism. They demand obedience to the text. So, you learn Galen like it's gospel, repeating his diagrams over and over, hoping they hold up when you're wrist-deep in a real person one day. And then, there are the whispered rumors. Somewhere, in a dark, shielded room, some universities conduct secret dissections. The University of Padua, someone mutters during a break between lectures. They say they've got an anatomical theatre. You're intrigued. It sounds incredible, students studying real human bodies, one layer of flesh at a time. Of course, it also sounds incredibly dangerous. Dissecting a human body might grant you unparalleled medical insight, but it could just as easily land you in serious trouble that starts with the church's disapproval and very well might end with something worse. But still, you dream of what it must be like, to peel back the skin of a cadaver and finally see the muscle, the fascia, the organs sitting in their rightful places, instead of imagining them from diagrams based on pigs. Sometimes, though, those whispers aren't just whispers, they're opportunities. Maybe your master knows someone who knows someone, or perhaps your university's reputation leans slightly more rebellious than faithful. Whatever the case, you find yourself standing in a dimly lit room one night, the air cold against your neck despite the lamps burning low. On the table in front of you lies a form covered with a damp sheet. Your stomach churns, more from nervous anticipation than from the sour smell of decay clinging faintly to the air. A wordless nod from your master, and the cloth is pulled away. There it is, a freshly deceased human body, pale and unfamiliar in the flickering light. The room feels electric silent, yet humming with suppressed emotion. Your master cuts into the chest, and the soft resistance of human flesh is unlike anything you ever witnessed slicing into an animal. Outwardly, you concentrate on copying every motion into precise notes, etching details into your memory the way your pen scratches furiously against the parchment. But inside, your thoughts tumble over themselves in chaos. The human body, for all its simplicity on a diagram, is impossibly intricate up close. Muscles twist in directions that seem illogical. Arteries lie thicker or thinner than described in Galenic texts. And then there's the heart, nestled firmly beneath the ribs, bloodless now but still somehow imposing. Your scribbles halt briefly when you realize there are no invisible pores connecting its chambers after all. Galen was wrong. This singular moment, that revelation feels as heavy as your books back in the lecture hall. The experience leaves you shaken in ways you don't entirely understand. On one hand, you feel exhilarated, even enlightened watching the body's mechanisms play out in real time, instead of reading about them blindly in Latin. On the other, you're terrified, because if Galen made mistakes, what else in your textbooks might be flawed? The unanswered questions press down on you even as the dissection continues. If surgery must rely on reality over tradition, then what happens to the anchors you've been taught to trust? Even unspoken, that very thought is heretical. When your turn comes to assist, trembling hands reach forward, the scalpel heavy between your fingers. You move slowly, delicately, half expecting a bolt of lightning from the heavens to strike you on the spot, but it doesn't come. Instead, you lift back a layer of skin. Underneath lies something you recognize, finally a faint reflection of those faded diagrams you've studied. It strikes you that, despite your fear, you're beginning to understand the structure, the function, the sheer genius of this complex machine. The thrill lingers for several days before fading into something more pragmatic. You realize that this was only a small piece of the puzzle, a glimpse, nothing more. You now carry with you not only the incredible excitement of that first dissection, but an unnerving awareness of how much remains hidden, how many errors from old texts still whisper quietly beneath the surface. How many patients will suffer because you had to learn from animals, from theory, from practices that ignore human bodies altogether? The thought tightens its grip on you as you return to your studies. Of course, most surgeons never witness or conduct a human dissection. You were one of the rare ones, fortunate or unlucky, depending on whom you ask. For the rest, surgical training remains an exercise in reading, imagining, and observing. You attend public demonstrations, studying the motions of a skilled barber surgeon as they repair wounds or amputate limbs. You pore over medical charts endlessly, tracing theoretical lines from one imagined body part to another. You bind wounds and practice incisions during your apprenticeship, but all the precision in your technique can't compensate for the parts nobody ever taught you about. How could they? The church's rules mean the bodies you actually need are the only ones you're not supposed to touch. Still, this is where the journey begins. On that table under the flickering lamps, amidst the whispers of sacrilege, you learned something irreversible both about the body and about medicine itself. Galen and the professors built you a framework, but surgery forces your hands to lift its weight alone. Now, with trembling determination and a growing awareness of the gaps in your knowledge, it's time to step into the next chapter, to apply what you've learned on the most unpredictable subject of Allah living, breathing patient. Whether you succeed will depend on everything you just saw and everything you didn't. You're standing in the middle of a battlefield mud, gripping at your boots, the air thick with smoke, the metallic tang of blood mixing with the earth. A soldier is brought to you, pale and trembling, an arrow lodged deep in his chest. You freeze. The textbooks didn't prepare you for this. Not the wooden bench of the lecture hall, not the theoretical dissections on goats. It's just you, a wounded man struggling for air, and a lot of rough tools spread out on a rickety table. What do I do? Barely forms in your mind before the grim realization sets in. Failure isn't an option. This is where medieval surgeons were Medea unmade. For all the years of theory, real training began in the chaos of war. Soldiers with open fractures, stab wounds, burned flesh, and arrows tearing through bone formed an endless, grim line outside makeshift tents. For you, each wounded man becomes another lesson in life and death. and each mistake serves as its own vivid reminder of what you were never taught correctly. Battlefields weren't just stages for war, they were brutal, hands-on classrooms. After all, no amount of lectures could prepare you for what bleeding out or festering wounds looked like up close. Most surgeons in your position have barely scratched the surface of medicine when they get thrown into war. That's because no one signs up calmly to test surgery on living, writhing human body sits thrust upon you by necessity. What sets war apart from more predictable cases back at the university or a local town is the sheer variety of injuries, and variety hardly covers it. From battered flesh to splintered bones, every battlefield injury challenges you differently. For example, broken bones were disturbingly common, especially during sieges or cavalry charges. A soldier might come stumbling in with multiple long bones snapped in ways that make your stomach shake. Your task? Grab the limb tightly, manipulate it back into place with bone-deep cracks you'll feel vibrate through your hands, then stabilize it using splints or a mixture of flour and egg whites, our primitive cast, if it could even be called that. But it's the arrows that haunt you most. The advent of the longbow has made them terrifyingly efficient, capable of slicing straight through armor and embedding themselves deep into flesh or bone, if the soldier is unlucky. The barbed designs of many arrowheads only make things harder. Trying to pull one out risks even more damage. Every single wound turns into an anatomy exam under harsh time pressure. Figure out where it's lodged, use the right technique for removal, and then stop the bleeding. That last part is critical because hemorrhage is your enemy. Your patient can bleed out faster than you can work, and you've heard the stories. Soldiers die horribly from botched extractions. Even royalty hasn't been immune. King Richard I of England didn't survive his arrow wound when a procedure went awry. That memory lingers as you steady your hands over the soldier with the arrow in his chest. First, you examine the wound closely, painfully aware that many arrows at this time are tipped with poison. If you see signs of sepsis or decay, you give up on heroics and focus on easing their suffering instead of prolonging it. But if the wound looks manageable, you begin. A careful incision around the flesh gives you some room to work. Sometimes the best move is to push the arrowhead through until it exits the other side, reducing the risk of shredding everything inside. If it's barbed and too risky to slide forward or backward, you might use tools to widen the wound just enough to break off the offending tip piece by piece. It's crude, bloody work, and all the while, you're praying his humours don't rebel in shock. Stopping hemorrhaging is its own battlefield nightmare. You've evolved quickly from watching textbook demonstrations to actual emergencies, every drop of blood forcing you to rethink your tools. You can bind wounds tightly in cloth, use heated cautery irons, or, if you dare, apply substances like spider webs or honey directly to the site. Yes, honey, it's sticky, but it reduces the risk of infections. You count heartbeats faintly under your fingers, waiting to see if life's pulse will stabilize. Breathe. Wait again. Then move to the next soldier. And the next. Bladed weapons, meanwhile, bring their own horrible complications. One glance at a mangled, slashed leg is often enough to tell you amputation remains the only choice. Amputations are quick and dirty by necessity. This isn't the controlled, sterile environment of today. A block is placed under the damaged limb, and you work fast, so fast your hands seem to shake even after you're done. First, you slice through the soft tissue. Then, with a bone saw gripped tightly, you cut clean through bone. If you're skilled, maybe it takes under a minute, but amputation doesn't end there. You tie ligatures around arteries to control the bleeding as best you can, and you sterilize well, as close to sterilize as medieval medicine allows. Mortality rates hover over your work like a silent judge. Many patients don't survive the shock or infections that follow. Amputations above the knee are particularly grim. Survival rates plummet so low that even success feels bittersweet. Burn victims crowd in too. Flaming oil, boiling liquids from sieges, they leave skin warped and blistered beyond recognition. Preventing infection is just step one. You also painstakingly apply ointments consisting of egg yolks, rose oil, and herbs to deadened flesh in hopes of calming the pain. The smell of burned skin, that doesn't leave your nostrils, not even after you finish, not even after the war ends. And yet, as brutal as this training ground is, it sharpens you. Each day forces you a little closer to understanding what no book can prepare you for. When you save a man's life, when the blood stops, the bone sets, or the wounds begin to close, it almost feels like victory. Almost. A soldier you've worked on thanks you, raspy and hoarse. and you smile back at him with a knot in your stomach because you know you didn't truly save him. You stabilized him for now, but you've seen all too many start to heal, only to succumb to fever and sepsis as infection spreads days after the battle ends. Even the successes don't allow you to rest easy. For every life pulled back from the brink, there's another you couldn't save. A man who collapsed as blood continued pouring too fast, another whose breathing gave out as the arrow pierced deeper than you thought. Those faces imprint themselves in your mind, following you long after the battlefield clears. Eventually, the war enser at least pauses long enough for you to make it back to your studies. Stepping through the gates of the university again feels like returning to another world. The safety of dusty books and grumbling professors seems too distant from the chaos you walked away from. And yet, something has changed. You move with the confidence of someone who knows the fragility of life up close and the value of even your most basic skills. What stays with you most, though, isn't just the surgical knowledge gained or the techniques refined under pressure. It's the questions. Why did the man with the collapsed lung die far faster than you thought he would? Why did cauterizing a seemingly simple wound lead to a fever that burned straight through another soldier's life? These puzzles stick in your head on quieter nights, urging you toward answers you might never find in a world where trial and error is the only research method you're allowed. Back in the relative calm of the university, you reopen Galen's texts, but they seem incomplete in a way they hadn't before. For the first time, you have reason to question, a glimmer of doubt mixing with determination. The battlefield didn't just reveal the limits of your knowledge, it fractured your reliance on tradition outright. Now, staring at the notes in front of you, knowing the gaps they contain might one day cost another life, you wonder what lies next. You haven't solved those mysteries yet, but you'll keep trying because, in medicine, there is no other way. A woman walks into your room, eyes wild and darting, her hands trembling as she clutches at her rosary. Her family mutters signs of the cross behind her, their fear as loud as any scream. They tell you she's been seeing shadows at night, hearing voices, things no one else can see or hear. The eldest son steps forward, leaning in close to explain what his mother cannot. These voices aren't hers. They're coming from something else. You listen carefully, but the words you're waiting for arrive all too predictably. "It's a curse," he says grimly. "A demon has taken her." You try to keep your face neutral. You've heard it before, so has every doctor in your time. But what are you meant to do now? Is this woman battling a sickness of the body, an error of humours spilling out into the mind, or is it something outside the flesh? A punishment? A haunting? The only certainty is that no one expects an easy answer, not from you, and certainly not from medicine. The truth is, in the world of medieval medicine, mental illness lives at the crowded intersection of faith, fear, and some very shaky science. When it comes to the medieval understanding of the mind, two possibilities always seem to sit side by side, physical and supernatural. On one hand, many scholars, your professors included, insist the brain or the humours must be blamed. They'll likely point to an excess of black bile, that infamous troublemaker, as the culprit behind melancholia. Black bile is cold and dry by nature, so too much of it not only drains the body of its natural warmth but also clouds rational thought. Depression, anxiety, confusion, they all supposedly flow from the same poisoned well. The solution? Balance must be restored. You might start with laxatives to purge the bile, or with bloodletting to drain the excess. These treatments, while far from perfect, fit within the framework you know, the one that says the body is an engine running on delicate, fluid mechanics. Change the inputs, fix the output, simple, at least in theory. But then there's the other possibility, the one whispered about by families huddled in candlelit homes, terrified to admit it aloud, the supernatural. To many, especially outside the university walls, mental illness isn't always seen as an imbalance of humours. It's the work of something far darker, demonic possession, a curse, or maybe even a punishment sent from above. Depending on where you are, the conclusion almost seems obvious. Wasn't the mind sacred, after all? Didn't the devil delight in using fragile, faithful minds as his playground? You can hardly blame families for considering this explanation, especially in cases where illnesses defy the tools of humoral medicine. So, alongside bloodletting and herbal potions, you might be called to recommend something far less technical: prayer, fasting, even an exorcism if the local clergy approves. And yes, physicians are often brought in to assist. Somehow, you've found yourself on the line where science kneels beside faith. What complicates everything is that both approaches feel, at least to some extent, incomplete. You've watched patients prescribed herbal remedies scream through the night, no better off than before. You've also seen priests wave incense over groaning patients as their families chant desperate prayers only for nothing to happen. The divide between treating the body and treating the soul is like standing at the edge of a dense forest. Parts are obscured, paths forward feel murky, and yet you're expected to do something, and failure is not an option anyone tolerates well. For the more daring or possibly desperate, there's always surgery. Trephining is one option you've heard discussed, though rarely without a sense of dread. The idea isn't new. In fact, it's ancient. For patients whose symptoms won't yield to anything else, your predecessors might propose drilling small holes into their skull. The thinking is simple. Give the minder, the evil within it, a way to escape. A blunt chisel or narrow saw might do the trick. You cringe at the thought of the instrument clanging against bone or the way the patient's head would have to be secured tightly no matter their screams. But then again, medicine in your era rarely spares its participants' discomfort. The procedure itself archaic, brutal feels as much like ritual as science, its practitioners caught between shaking hands and a belief that this, surely, must work, somehow. For others, herbal treatments offer a softer, if no less uncertain, alternative. Calming herbs like valerian, chamomile, or even wine-laced tonics might ease the worst agitation of a fevered mind. And yet, how often can you stand over a patient and wonder if these concoctions truly work, or if they simply lull families into a fragile hope that the doctor has done something useful? Of course, not all plants are friendly. The truly ambitious might experiment with mandrake root, highly toxic, but whispered to have undeniable powers over the body and, by extension, the mind. The line between treatment and poison is eerily thin. You can never be certain you've dosed just enough to soothe without veering into peril. Then, there are the patients themselves, and here's where your struggle grows sharp. Because mental ailments don't manifest quietly, they arrive, shaking loudly into the world. A man who believes devils clutch at him is unlikely to lie still for your examination. Some patients wail near perpetually, their voices hoarse, and their exhausted families begging you for answers. Others retreat so deeply into their own broken thoughts that getting them to meet your gaze feels insurmountable. They speak in nonsense, they lash out at unseen fears, and somewhere along the way, you stop seeing their illness as just a puzzle to solve and start seeing the raw suffering underneath. And this is where the weight of medieval medicine lands heaviest. Because no prayer, no potion, no hole drilled through bone can promise relief. For everything you've dissected and memorized, nothing prepares you for the haunting reality of patients you cannot help. You might assign them endless remedies and explanations. You'll explain to their families the diagnosis black bile, an imbalance, a divine lesson sent as punishment. But when their eyes continue to show fear, confusion, and agony, the walls of theory crumble beneath you. You start to understand that no amount of herbs or bloodletting will reshape something so complex as the human mind. Still, every once in a while something works, almost miraculously. Maybe it's luck, maybe it's faith, perhaps it's just the body righting itself in ways you don't yet understand. But there's a moment, and it hits you with full force. A woman who hasn't slept in days rises calmly one morning, the shadows from under her eyes retreating. A man plagued for months by whispers and flashes of anger suddenly recalls how to smile, how to speak softly to his children again. You watch it unfold, startled and relieved, but also keenly aware of how little credit you, or anyone, can truly claim for what just happened. Success in treating mental illness feels different. It's humbling. It reminds you that so much about the human mind and the human soul still lies thoroughly beyond your grasp. And yet you keep trying. Every patient's case forces you to balance faith and science, even when the weight of one far outweighs the other. In treatment rooms and peasant homes, you find yourself adapting, listening more closely, praying when it's asked of you, mixing herbs when nothing else seems to stick. Somehow, despite your skepticism of some diagnoses and methods, you return to the work again and again. The limits of what you know are endless, but so is the need placed before you. Later that evening, after the day's patients have quieted, you sit by candlelight with your notes. Your master's voice echoes faintly in your head. Medicine is about harmony, about restoring balance. But now, with this strange and unfamiliar arena of mental health rolling fresh in your mind, the old lessons seem half-finished. Harmony, you're learning, isn't something you can force. Sometimes it emerges on its own. Other times, it never arrives, no matter how many remedies you pour into it. And so, you begin to ponder something beyond the next cure or treatment. Yes, You're here to learn the craft of saving lives, the procedures and theories, the cutting-edge tools of 1300s medicine. But with every mental illness you've faced, one thing becomes clear. Perhaps medicine isn't just about curing. Perhaps it lies, just as much, in listening. By showing compassion to those whose affliction makes them utterly unreachable, you shift from healer to something simpler, human. As the candle's wax pools lower, you realize this field you've chosen will likely ask more questions than it can answer. Yet that, you reflect with surprising certainty, is precisely why it matters. For years, your life has revolved around lectures, endless Latin texts, and the humours of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. But now, as the first light of morning pushes through your window, the weight of today settles on you like an iron cloak. This is it, graduation day. Well, assuming you pass, because nothing is guaranteed not when the final examination is involved. You've made it through the grueling years of study, debates with fellow students that lasted until the candles burned out, and the occasional sleepless night wondering if you'd somehow make a catastrophic misstep. But today is different. Today determines whether all of that was worth it, or if you just spent years memorizing Hippocratic texts only to go back to whatever simple life you left behind. It's not just about knowing the material it never was. The examination combines theory, skill, and frankly, a public display of composure under pressure. You walk into the hall, where professors sit in a semicircle like a tribunal. Their faces range from uninterested to outright skeptical, as if they've already decided you won't impress them. Your notes won't help you here. This is about what's in your head and how convincingly you can argue your case. They start with questions designed to probe the depths of what you've learned. You recite passages from Galen's work on the cardiovascular system, then explain how certain herbs might rebalance a phlegmatic patient's humours. Someone asks whether astrology would factor into diagnosing a farmer from the countryside, and just like that, you're talking about the placement of Saturn and its influence on cold and dry temperaments. Every word you speak feels weighed, measured, and judged. Then comes the practical portion, and this is where things get real. No theoretical farmer or hypothetical patient this time. You're presented with an actual case, usually a local person with a visible illness. It's expected that your diagnosis will not only demonstrate your understanding but also your ability to think critically. The patient limps forward, and you begin your examination under the hawk-like gaze of your professors. Your mind races. What's their complexion? How is their speech? Every clue matters. You ask questions, but you're also expected to deduce what they can't or won't tell you. By now you've set hundreds of bones in your apprentice years, balanced countless diets, even dabbled in minor surgeries under supervision. But here and now, with this patient and a row of judges breathing down your neck, every skill you've sharpened feels suddenly unsure. If you misstep, you can feel it immediately in the room. One professor clears their throat. Another tilts their head in that silent way that says, "Are you sure about that, young scholar?" The questions come fast, slicing through any sense of comfort. Why did you recommend a hot remedy instead of a cool one? Are you certain the imbalance is in the blood and not the phlegm? And this one stings the most. Why didn't you time the treatment to align with yesterday's favorable astrological conditions? You explain, or you try to. Sometimes your answers land, and you see them nod almost imperceptibly. Other times, you wish the floor would swallow you, because nothing in your preparation could make you ready for this level of scrutiny. And yet, somehow, you survive it. The questions end, the patient is led away, and you're left standing before the panel as they scribble notes you can't see. Your heart pounds as you glance around the room. Some of these students, your competitors and companions, have already been dismissed, their faces pale and drawn. The ones still waiting fidget nervously, some muttering prayers under their breath. You know them well by now, but today everyone feels like a stranger. Then, after what feels like years but is probably only minutes, you're summoned back in. This time, their expressions are unreadable. One professor begins to speak, not looking at you but at the notes in front of him. Slowly, as the words tumble out, you realize that they aren't handing you failure. You've done it. You passed. The title of physician is yours to claim. Relief trickles through you unevenly. Part of you had been convinced you'd fall short, even after everything. But when they hand you your certificate, your proof, you feel an unexpected chill run down your spine. This isn't just a piece of parchment. It's a key, a door into the real world of medicine, where the stakes are as high as life and death, and the safety net of university walls no longer shields you. The celebrations in the streets that night are lively, if not grand. Students seemed to pop out of every corner, spilling into the taverns, their relief bubbling over into slightly off-key chants and drunken debates about Galen versus Avicenna. You're swept up in the revelry for a while, laughing and clinking cups with people you once shared sleepless study sessions with. But as the night winds down, something gnaws at you, the unshakable awareness that this victory also marks the start of something far harder. A practicing physician in this world isn't just someone who understands the human body. You're someone who carries an enormous weight. Every patient you meet, whether they're a noble with gout or a farmer with a fever, will look to you for answers, and some of them, you already know, won't get what they're hoping for. Your professors drilled you in the balance of humours and the art of diagnosis, but not every imbalance can be righted. You think back to the battlefield injuries you saw during your apprentice years, or the mental illnesses that defied both prayer and potions. You've learned so much, yet you know it's not enough. Still, the expectations that now rest on your shoulders are so heavy they're almost dizzying. You're not just a student anymore. You are a physician. It doesn't help that medieval society doesn't see all doctors as equals. Sure, your university education grants you the highest rank in the medical world, a position of respect and status. But it's not a wide-open field. You'll need to navigate around rival healers, barber surgeons, herbalists, midwives. They don't have your credentials, but they do have the trust of certain communities. If you plan to survive in this field, you'll have to earn your patients' trust, too, often among people who view physicians with suspicion. After all, your medical license doesn't guarantee success. It barely guarantees survival. And then there's the potential for failure, the unspoken truth no one ever talks about during lectures. Surgery that doesn't save the patient, treatments that don't take. There will be moments where every ounce of knowledge you've gained feels useless, where patients meet their end, not because you didn't try, but because you couldn't stop what was coming. As you fold and tuck your freshly printed diploma away, this reality settles in your chest like a stone. You've mastered the curriculum, sure, but what about everything that lies beyond it? Strangely, there's also a spark of hope cradled inside the fear. You've seen how fragile and incomplete this field of medicine is, and yet you've felt glimmers of its potential. In the battlefield classroom, amidst the bloody chaos, you discovered new ways to treat injuries that the textbooks never mentioned. In dark nights during your earliest apprentice years, star charts helped you time treatments to success, even when luck seemed against you. Medicine, despite its many flaws, feels like a path forward, even if it's paved unevenly. By the time you leave the university square to begin your first post as a practicing physician, you feel the weight of the title pressing into your shoulders. It's the pride of knowing you've succeeded this far, mixed with the undeniable fear of what's next. The patients will come, the failures will come, and with them, the triumphs, the small moments where lives are saved, pain is eased, and balance, if only briefly, is restored. You step away from the flickering lamps that line the university's stone walls. Ahead lies a world both familiar and completely new, waiting for your work. Behind you, the chants of students celebrating their own victories begin to fade. What you feel now isn't joy or fear. It's motion, a kind of forward pull you can't resist, drawing you further into the unknown landscape of medieval medicine. How much will you change it? That, only time will tell. How did the lessons of medieval medicine shape the future of healthcare? You might not think the patchwork world of medieval treatments could birth anything lasting after all. We're talking about balancing humours with leeches and checking astrological charts to time bloodletting. But here's the truth. Our modern medical system owes more to this era of questionable diagnoses and improvised tools than you'd expect. Beneath its obvious flaws, medieval medicine built the scaffolding for what we now take for granted, from university-trained doctors to organised hospitals. It was messy, yes, but it was also the moment when medicine stopped being folklore and started aiming, however shakily, at science. To start with, universities changed everything. Before the 12th century, medical knowledge passed from one person to another, like an oral tradition, more storytelling than structured education. But with the rise of institutions like Bologna, Paris, and Montpellier, medicine became something more formalized. Picture this: stone lecture halls filled with scholars debating ancient texts, scribbling notes as professors quoted Galen, and monks in nearby monasteries meticulously copying these works to ensure the knowledge wouldn't vanish. Sure, these universities leaned heavily on ancient Greek, Roman, and Islamic medicine, but for the first time in history, there was a system that required you to prove you'd learned the material before someone ever let you practice medicine. That system? It's the ancestor of medical schools today. And then there were the texts themselves, massive tomes like Avicenna's Canon of Medicine. Originally written in Persian and then translated into Latin, this became the go-to guide for medieval medical students. It categorized illnesses, described treatments, and connected ideas from Greek, Indian, and Arab physicians, blending them into a unified body of knowledge. Was every line packed with accurate information? No, not even close. This was still the era of humors and invisible heart pause. But the idea that you could gather, organize, and standardize medical knowledge was revolutionary. Today, we call it evidence-based medicine. Back then, it was rudimentary, but it was a start. Let's talk about surgery for a minute. If you think medieval surgeons were all blind stabs, pun absolutely intended, in the dark, you're not entirely wrong, but they weren't entirely right either. Figures like Mondino Deleuze began pushing boundaries by performing human dissections, often enough to argue against Galen when his anatomical descriptions didn't match reality. These discoveries laid crucial groundwork for future breakthroughs, even if they didn't always mesh with the church's approval. Surgeons of this time also managed to refine techniques, like tying off blood vessels during amputations instead of just cauterizing, the stumper technique, revived and perfected by Ambroise Paré centuries later. Sure, medieval surgery didn't yet have concepts like bacteria or germs on its side, but it provided a foundation for anatomy and operative procedures. And hospitals, let's not forget those. The concept of hospitals in medieval Europe wasn't anything like today's sprawling medical complexes. But the basics started here. Take the charitable hospitals of France and Italy. These were places where the sick, poor, and dying could find care, or at the very least, kindness. Monks and nuns often ran them, blending spirituality with practical medicine. During times of plague, some hospitals even evolved into quarantine zones, isolating the ill from healthy populations. This system of centralized care flawed, though it became the prototype for the modern hospital. They provided a space not only for healing but also for training, where young physicians could learn the practical side of medicine instead of just memorizing theory. And then came the breakdowns. Medieval medicine, for all its focus on humors, couldn't prepare anyone for crises like the Black Death. The 14th century's most infamous catastrophe didn't just kill millions, it exposed the horrifying limitations of doctors whose knowledge still clung to ancient texts. Quarantine measures, however rudimentary, emerged from this era-basic ideas about isolating the sick that, over time, fed into modern concepts of public health. Though the plague swept through with little resistance, it forced medieval society to consider disease transmission in ways they hadn't before. Sanitation and environmental conditions, those details we now file under public health, started earning attention, however slowly. But let's not sugarcoat it. Medieval medicine often leaned hard into guesswork. If you've spent any time squinting at Latin diagrams showing zodiac signs covering the human body, you already know astrology had a starring role in diagnoses. Today, it feels borderline cartoonish to imagine a doctor timing your treatment based on the moon. But consider this: medieval physicians operated in a world without microscopes, thermometers, or even a basic understanding of germs. Everything was interconnected in their eyes, the stars above, the body below. Wrong? Yes. Ingenious? Also, yes. It's easy to laugh now, but the belief that external conditions, astrological or otherwise, influenced health planted the earliest seeds of studying external factors like environment or lifestyle. Fast forward a few centuries, and you've arrived at modern epidemiology. Speaking of seeds, medieval Europe laid literal ones too. The study of plants experienced huge growth during this time, as universities established medicinal gardens for education and experimentation. The printing press introduced richly illustrated herbals, aligning plants with their therapeutic uses in texts that spread widely among scholars. This isn't just precursor trivia. The revival of botany and medicine informed centuries of advancements in pharmacology, keeping the idea of natural remedies alive in Thailand even alongside the synthetic drugs of modern science. And despite their reliance on faulty theories, medieval physicians did push boundaries. Figures like Paracelsus eventually began rejecting humoral theory outright, claiming illnesses arose from outside agents, shifting medicine toward the field of toxicology. His contemporary, Girolamo Fracastoro, went even further by proposing that epidemics were caused by contagious seeds, an early, if metaphorical, glimpse toward the germ theory we know today. These weren't just random strokes of genius, they were shaped by the frameworks of centuries-old medieval practices, even if those practices were starting to crack under pressure. But let's zoom out. With all its misstepsits, bloodletting, stargazing, and deeply questionable skull drilling, what did medieval medicine actually achieve? Surprisingly, a lot. It institutionalized learning, ensuring physicians shared a common base of knowledge rather than fragmented local traditions. It preserved and expanded ancient work while beginning to question it. And perhaps most importantly, it created a system that allowed future scientists to experiment, ask better questions, and push beyond the limits of tradition. The Renaissance couldn't have happened without medieval medicine. From the surgical tables of war-torn Europe to the quiet monastic halls where texts were copied and translated, this era planted major signposts for the future. It bridged the ancient world's fragmented medical theories with the rigors of modern scientific inquiry, no matter how shaky the bridge sometimes felt. The failures of humoral medicine didn't just highlight gaps, they carved out space for discovery. So yes, when you're lying in a sterile hospital room today, surrounded by machines your medieval counterparts couldn't dream of, it's easy to dismiss their contributions. But those modern machines, they exist because someone back then looked at the stars and dared to wonder if they held answers. They exist because medieval monks copied the canon of medicine, ensuring its survival. They exist because someone thought to tie a vessel instead of burning it, or to measure disease transmission, even when they didn't fully understand what they were seeing. The journey of medieval medicine wasn't perfected, was strange, chaotic, and often riddled with ignorance. But for all its stumbles, it never stopped moving forward. It laid a foundation. And even if that foundation was messy, it was enough to sustain the next leap and the leap after that. People built rockets to the moon with better tools than medieval physicians, sure. But the courage of asking how and why, that hasn't changed. Imagine being a physician in 1300, facing the unimaginable while clutching a textbook that's centuries old. They balanced religion, ancient theories, and the barest observations of the human body. Yet somehow they persevered. Those imperfect method-scribbling notes in dim lecture halls, mapping humours, trusting the star set, the stage for medicine to evolve. The first medical universities pulled humanity just slightly from chaos, inching towards something like structure. And that's where the real legacy lies. Not in getting it right, but in daring to ask, what if there's more? Questioning, learning, building medicine's foundation rests here. So, what else from the past could still shape tomorrow?